Good morning. Today is the third day of Cheshvan and the 18th of October. We're up to the fourth reading of Noach, and I'd like to look at just the first verse. The first verse actually is a very rare verse because it says, God spoke to Noach saying. This is almost like the most generic verse in the Torah, because we have many times that God spoke to Moses saying, and this is one of the shortcomings of studying Bible in English, where there's usually no differentiation between different names of God. So what most people might not know is that whenever it says God spoke to Moses saying, or God spoke to anyone saying, God spoke to Abraham saying, it's God's four-letter name that appears. This is one of only 3 times in the entire Torah where the name of God used is Elohim. And what is the difference, first of all, between these two names? So the 4-letter name, the one that's usually used, is usually called the essential name, Yud Kei Vav Kei. And that name is both a name that connotes God's measure of compassion, but it is also meant to connote God's unknowable essence. So it's a very complex name in that sense. It has a meaning. You could theoretically even pronounce it if it was only that meaning, the compassionate side that God reveals in the world. But because it also refers to God's unknowable and unutterable essence, so we don't pronounce it. It says that in the world to come, meaning after the redemption, that we will pronounce it. Exactly what that means and what would be the change and why would that be permitted is a topic for a different discussion. But now we want to look at the 3 times that we have this phrase, God spoke, using this name Elohim. Now Elohim it really means the master of all the powers. What do we mean by powers, faculties, abilities? Whatever you can think of. Whether it's the power to create a universe, whether it's the power to create a black hole, whether it's the power to be compassionate, the power to be... It's all the powers, everything. From reality to psychology, everything in between. He's the master of all these powers. That's why this name is also, in some sense, almost problematic, because it has a yud mem suffix, and a yud mem suffix in Hebrew means that it's plural. So it's saying that he is the master of the many faculties, of the many powers. There's actually very little difference between this name and the word that we use in Hebrew to designate idolatry. When we say idols, we say Elil. It comes from the same word. By the way, in Arabic, the word Allah means the same thing, the power. That's what it literally means. And El is a power. Elilim is many idols, powers that are disjointed. They're not connected to one another. Each one is separate. And when I want to say God with a lowercase g in Hebrew, I say Elim, which means many powers, many different gods. A God, literally in this meaning, is not God as good, it's God in the sense of power. So it's a very big question, why in these 3 times, why the Torah even mentions it at all, that God would say in the sense of a certain power, or the master of all the powers. We would expect it to be Havaya said, the essential name of God said, the unutterable name of God said. So to understand this, we need to look at the 2 other times when this appears, when this happens. So one of them, I just finished a long series of classes on. It's on the YouTube channel. It's called Is Exile a Punishment, I believe. I think it's 30-something classes on this topic. And there we find in the book of Exodus that when Moses is first sent to Egypt, and the plan seems to be backfiring, and the situation becomes worse, he says to God, why have you done poorly to this people by sending me? And what do they need me for? It's only become worse. And God replies to him. It says, Elohim said to Moses, I am God. I am Havaya. I am the four-letter name. But he addressed him as God spoke to Moses was the name Elohim, like in our verse, the first verse of the fourth reading, which is chapter 8, verse 15. The third time is just prior to the Ten Commandments. It says, "Vaydaber Elokim et kol hadvarim ha'ele lemor." God spoke all these things, saying. We've spoken in the past a little bit about this verse. I hope that when we come to Exodus, to Parashat Yitro, we'll speak about it more in depth. There, he also uses God spoke, Elohim spoke. In the two times in the book of Exodus that this name appears in the sense of speaking, Rashi, the classic commentary in the Torah, gives an explanation. He says, why did God use it? With regard to Moses, he says, you're coming to me claiming that I'm not just. That why have I hurt the people? Why have I acted poorly with them? Why have I sent you? And the situation has only worsened. But you should know that I am the judge of all the earth, and I judge those who are just and righteous, and I judge those who are evil and unjust, and implying you shouldn't come to me with these questions. These questions are incorrect. I am just. And so the word Elohim here, the name Elohim, is exactly what it means. It's justice. We associate each one of the 7 holy names of God with one of the Sfirot, with one of the divine channels of effluence. And so Elohim is associated with Gevura, with might, or justice. So that's what Rashi explains there at the beginning of Exodus. When we come to the 10 Commandments, Rashi says, you should know that there's a special teaching here about the 10 Commandments. Normally, if the Torah says to do something, it gives us a positive, prescriptive commandment. You're not punished if you don't perform it. You're only punished normally, when there's an explicit commandment not to do something. Although there are exceptions. And he says this is one of the exceptions. When the Torah says, honor your father and your mother, you should know that here there is justice, and so God said, God spoke, Elohim spoke all these words, these 10 commandments, so that you know that if you honor your father and your mother, you get a reward, and if you don't, you get a punishment. Same thing for Shabbat. If you keep Shabbat, you get a reward, and if you don't keep Shabbat, you get a punishment, and so on. So all these things, these two examples, Rashi explains, but he doesn't explain anything the first time that this happens in our verse. Again, chapter 8, verse 15. He doesn't say anything about this. So we have to, in a certain sense, complete his commentary. We can't know exactly what he would have said, but we have to think about what it says here. And the idea here, says Rabbi Ginsburg, is that the name Elohim has another meaning, except for judgment, and except for being the master of all powers. It has a meaning that it is nature. So what we're talking about is not just powers like psychological powers and so on, faculties. We're also talking about the rules of nature, what we would call today the natural laws, the laws of nature, whether it be gravity or electromagnetism or whatever it is. The laws of nature are designated by the name Elohim. That's the name. So when God set up the world and he built the laws of nature into it, which he doesn't normally change, these laws in their entirety are referred to as Elohim. And there's a beautiful gematria that was developed we know about it from the Middle Ages, that Elohim equals nature. It's actually, of course, an equality. Elokim equals 86, and nature equals 86 also. Nature is hateva in Hebrew. It's also, you can hear, if you know Hebrew, it should have been just teva. But even the word teva did not exist in Hebrew until the 10th century. So, in any case, that's the idea here. So what is God saying to Noah? Again, he's saying to him, let's read it. He says, God says to Noah, leave the ark, you, together with your wife and your sons, with your sons' wives, all living creatures, from all flesh, birds, livestock, and all the reptiles that crawl upon the ground, tell them to leave with you. They will teem on the earth and be fruitful and multiply in the earth. So what's he saying to him? The flood is over. The flood is over, you can leave the ark. So why does he say it with the name Elokim? Because the entire time that the flood was happening, there was no nature. The laws of nature were uprooted. It says that during that year that they were locked into the ark, surviving, you couldn't see the sky. There were no stars. You couldn't see the sun, you couldn't see the moon. Gives us a certain idea about what had happened. Maybe one of the theories is perhaps indeed it was an asteroid that struck the earth, or something like that. But it became impossible to even follow. The laws of nature didn't work the way that they usually worked. And so to get them out, to bring them out of the ark, God is not giving them judgment. On the opposite, he's saying, I am God who creates the rules of nature. Leave the ark now, and you will find that the world is back to being normal. You'll find that the laws of nature again are functioning, and it's possible to live. Now this is a very deep idea, that there are times in humanity's history when nature doesn't function the way it should. Normally we say that when nature doesn't function the way it should, it's a miracle. But sometimes, like in the case of Noah, it's a calamity. And you feel that everything is broken. You feel that nothing is working the way it should be working. What's the idea here? The Zohar has a beautiful, one of the most beautiful images, metaphors, for understanding how God's judgment works. It says that God is like the potter who uses a potter's wheel, and nature is constantly spinning on it. In other words, nature is like the world, the universe is like a piece of clay spinning constantly. And like a potter, God is shaping it the way he wants. Because you could think that maybe if nature is already set, God created it in a certain way, it can't change. It says no, says the Zohar. The potter, even though he took a piece of clay, and that clay is not going to change, but its shape, what it becomes, its behavior will change based on what he does with his fingers. Says the Zohar, in this metaphor, the actions of the righteous, the actions of the wicked, are like God's hands that shape nature constantly. And so you can think about it, I don't know if you've ever seen this, but a potter can start over again with one little chip of his finger. You stick it in there, and the clay falls on itself, and you start again, and it starts again. And a person who has felt these things in his life needs to know that that's exactly what they went through. That the potter's wheel is constantly spinning. In fact, the word nature in Hebrew derives from the same word that means a wheel or a circle or a ring, a tabat. Same thing as teva. And so that's how nature is. Even though nature is pretty set, the actions that we conduct ourselves with, the way that we behave, the way that we carry ourselves in the world, has a tremendous effect even on nature. Because God is constantly spinning nature on the potter's wheel, constantly shaping it, redefining it. Again, it stays within the confines of the initial piece of clay, but it constantly can change and shift into different shapes. So God was telling Noah, come out of the ark now. I shifted nature back to a place where you can leave the ark, you can be fruitful and multiply again. And you should know that always, even if there is a terrible calamity, by the actions of the righteous, it can be either prevented, or even if it had to happen afterwards, there can be actual true rebuilding, and nature can become solid again. It can become something that you can count on, something that you can work with. Because at its core, it has this might of the name Elohim. It has this ability to stay constant. Thank you very much.